Close your eyes for a moment and imagine. You cannot speak. You have no words, no grammar, no syntax, no ability to say, I am hungry, or there is a lion behind that tree, or I love you. Yet you need to survive. You need to cooperate with others. You need to share information, express emotions, coordinate hunts, warn of danger, teach your children. How do you do it? This was the reality for our ancestors for hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of years. Language, as we know it, is relatively recent in human evolution. Modern humans have existed for roughly 300,000 years, but complex spoken language with full grammar and syntax, that probably emerged sometime between 50 and 100,000 years ago. Maybe earlier, maybe later. Scientists debate the exact timing, but what is clear is that for the vast majority of human evolution, our ancestors communicated without language as we understand it today. This raises a fascinating question. How did they do it? How did early humans, and the human species that came before us, communicate complex ideas without words? How did they coordinate group activities? How did they pass knowledge from one generation to the next? How did they form the social bonds necessary for survival? These are not idle questions. Understanding pre-linguistic communication tells us something fundamental about what makes us human, about the roots of language, about the evolution of the human mind. The challenge is that we cannot observe pre-linguistic communication directly. Those humans are long gone. They left no recordings, no written records, obviously. What we have are clues, fossils that tell us about brain size and structure, anatomical evidence about vocal apparatus, archaeological evidence of complex behaviors that required cooperation, comparisons with our closest living relatives, the great apes, studies of human infants before they acquire language, and increasingly, genetic evidence about when key language-related genes evolved. From these scattered pieces of evidence, scientists have constructed theories about how communication evolved, about the progression from simple signals to complex language, about the intermediate stages, about what our ancestors could and could not communicate. This detective work combines paleontology, anthropology, linguistics, neuroscience, primatology, genetics, and more. It is one of the great interdisciplinary puzzles in science. And while we do not have all the answers, we have learned an enormous amount. Today, we will explore this mystery. We will look at how our ape cousins communicate and what that tells us about our own ancestors. We will examine the anatomy of early humans and what it reveals about their communication abilities. We will investigate gesture, facial expression, vocalization, and other non-linguistic communication methods. We will explore theories about how language evolved from these simpler forms, and we will ask what all of this tells us about the nature of human communication today. This is not just an academic question. Understanding how humans communicated before language helps us understand what language is for, what problems it solves, what makes it so powerful. It also helps us understand nonverbal communication, which remains crucial even today. We are all still using many of the same signals our pre-linguistic ancestors used. Facial expressions, gestures, tone of voice, body language. These ancient forms of communication persist because they work. They convey information that words alone cannot. Moreover, studying pre-linguistic communication tells us about human cognitive evolution. Language did not appear from nowhere. It built on earlier communication systems. Understanding those earlier systems helps us understand the cognitive capabilities that existed before language, the kinds of thoughts our ancestors could have, the kinds of social relationships they could form, the kinds of cultures they could create. All of this happened before words, before grammar, before syntax. Yet it was sophisticated enough to allow humans to survive and thrive. So let us begin this journey into the silent world of our ancestors. A world where communication happened, where ideas were shared, where bonds were formed, all without the words we take for granted today. It is a world that is strange to imagine, yet fundamental to understanding who we are. Because before we could speak, we still needed to communicate, and we found ways to do it. Ways that were creative, sophisticated, and effective enough to carry our species through hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. This is the story of how humans communicated before language, and it is a story worth telling. Before we dive deeper, let me clarify what we mean by language. This is important because the term can be used in different ways. When scientists talk about language, they usually mean a system with specific properties. It must have symbols, arbitrary signs that represent concepts. It must have grammar, rules for combining those symbols. It must be productive, capable of creating infinite messages from finite elements. And it must allow displacement, talking about things not immediately present in time or space. Animal communication systems, even sophisticated ones, typically lack some or all of these properties. A dog's bark is not symbolic, it is an emotional expression. A bee's waggle dance, though it conveys information about food location, is not productive. It cannot discuss anything except food sources. Whale songs, though complex and culturally transmitted, do not have grammar or displacement. These are all communication systems, but they are not language in the technical sense. Understanding this distinction helps us understand what our pre-linguistic ancestors could and could not do. And here is something crucial. The absence of language does not mean the absence of intelligence or culture. Our ancestors were smart, creative, resourceful people long before they had words. They made tools, controlled fire, cared for their sick, buried their dead, created art. All of this required intelligence, planning, social cooperation, but it happened through non-linguistic communication. This shows that many aspects of human cognition and culture can exist without language. Language enhanced these abilities enormously, but it did not create them from nothing. What we can learn from apes. To understand how early humans communicated, we start by looking at our closest living relatives, the great apes. Chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, and orangutans share a common ancestor with humans. Chimpanzees and bonobos, our closest cousins, share about 98% of their DNA with us. We diverged from them only about 6 to 7 million years ago. That is recent in evolutionary terms. So studying how apes communicate gives us clues about how our common ancestors communicated, and probably how early humans communicated before language evolved. Let us start with vocalizations. All apes produce sounds. Chimpanzees have a repertoire of perhaps 20 to 30 distinct vocalizations. Each serves a specific function. There are alarm calls for different types of predators, food calls when discovering a valuable food source, pant hoots for long-distance communication, screams when threatened or in pain, soft grunts and pants during friendly interactions. These vocalizations are largely innate, meaning they are hardwired by genetics rather than learned through culture. This is a crucial difference from human language. Chimpanzees raised in isolation still produce the same calls as wild chimpanzees. They do not need to learn them. A baby chimpanzee separated from its group will still give the correct alarm call when it sees a snake. The call is instinctive. Human language, by contrast, must be learned. A child raised without exposure to language will not spontaneously develop speech. This tells us that ape vocalizations are fundamentally different from human words. They are emotional expressions, not symbolic communication. But apes communicate in many ways beyond vocalization. Facial expressions are rich and varied. A fear grimace shows submission. A play face signals friendly intent. Intense staring can be a threat. Apes read these expressions instinctively and respond appropriately. These facial expressions are homologous with human expressions. When you smile, you are using muscles and expressions that our ape ancestors used millions of years ago. The biology is the same. The meaning is similar. This is ancient communication, preserved across evolutionary time. Gestures are perhaps the most interesting aspect of ape communication. Unlike vocalizations, gestures in apes show some flexibility and intentionality. A chimpanzee may extend its hand, palm up, to request food from another individual. It may throw its arm forward to signal "come here." It may raise an arm to request grooming. These gestures are used deliberately, directed at specific individuals, and modified based on whether the recipient is paying attention. If a gesture does not work, the chimpanzee may try a different gesture. This shows intentionality. Some gestures appear to be learned or culturally transmitted. Different chimpanzee groups use slightly different gestures for similar purposes. This suggests these gestures are not entirely hardwired, but can be modified through social learning. This is significant. It shows that even before language, our ape relatives had some capacity for learned, flexible communication. Not to the extent humans do, but the foundation was there. The cognitive capacity for intentional, learned signaling existed millions of years before humans evolved. Body posture and movement also communicate. A chimpanzee standing bipedally with arms raised looks larger and more threatening. Hunched posture signals submission. Piloerection, where the hair stands up, makes an individual look bigger and more intimidating. Swagger walks, charging displays, branch waving, all of these communicate strength and status. These are theatrical performances designed to convey information without physical contact. They work because other chimpanzees understand what they mean. Touch is another crucial communication channel. Grooming is not just hygiene, but social bonding. It reduces tension, establishes alliances, reinforces social hierarchies. A reassuring touch on the shoulder can calm an agitated individual. Embrace after conflict signals reconciliation. Mother and infant communicate constantly through touch. Nursing, carrying, comforting. This tactile communication is universal among primates and was certainly important for early humans as well. Now, here is where it gets interesting. Researchers have taught some apes to use human communication systems. The most famous example is probably Coco, a gorilla who learned over 1,000 signs in American Sign Language. Washu, a chimpanzee, learned about 350 signs. Kanzi, a bonobo, learned to use a symbol board with hundreds of lexicograms. These apes demonstrated they could learn symbolic communication. They could combine symbols in novel ways to express new meanings. This was groundbreaking research, but there are important limitations. Apes do not spontaneously develop symbolic systems on their own. They need extensive human training. Their combinations of symbols rarely show grammatical structure. A chimpanzee might sign, "Give orange, me give eat, orange, me eat." Orange rather than the grammatically correct "give me orange to eat." They communicate desires and immediate needs, but rarely discuss abstract concepts, past events, or future plans. Their communication, even with symbols, remains mostly focused on the here and now. What does this tell us about early humans? It tells us that the cognitive capacity for symbolic communication existed in our common ancestor with apes. The raw material was there. Our ancestors, 6 million years ago, probably had communication abilities similar to modern chimpanzees. A repertoire of innate vocalizations, flexible use of gestures, rich facial expressions, body language, tactile communication. This was the baseline. This was the starting point from which human language evolved. It also tells us that something changed in the human lineage. We evolved capabilities that apes do not have. The ability to learn complex symbolic systems easily. The ability to combine symbols according to grammatical rules. The ability to discuss things not immediately present. The ability to tell stories about the past and plan for the future. These abilities required evolutionary changes in brain structure, in vocal anatomy, possibly in genetics. Understanding what changed and when is the next part of our story. But before we move on, appreciate what apes can do. Their communication is sophisticated. It conveys emotional states, intentions, social relationships, information about the environment. It allows complex social dynamics, alliances, dominance hierarchies, reconciliation after conflict, cooperative hunting, food sharing. Chimpanzees have culture. Different groups have different tool use traditions, different grooming styles, different hunting techniques. All of this is transmitted socially, without language. This shows that complex culture does not require words. Our ancestors, before they had language, were probably capable of similar cultural transmission. This is important to remember as we trace the evolution of human communication, the anatomy of early humans. Now let us turn to the fossil record. When we examine the bones and skulls of early humans and their ancestors, what do they tell us about communication ability? Quite a lot, actually. Physical anatomy sets limits on what sounds can be produced, how complex those sounds can be, how much cognitive capacity exists for processing communication. Let us start with the vocal apparatus, the physical equipment needed for speech. Modern humans have a uniquely descended larynx. The larynx, or voice box, sits lower in the throat than in other primates. This creates a longer pharynx, the cavity above the larynx. This longer pharynx acts as a resonating chamber, allowing us to produce a wider range of sounds, particularly the vowels that are essential for spoken language. But there is a trade-off. A descended larynx increases the risk of choking because food and air share the same pathway for a longer distance. We evolved this risky anatomy because the benefits for speech were worth it. When did the larynx descend? We cannot see soft tissue in fossils, but we can make inferences from bone structure. The base of the skull, where the spinal cord enters, changes shape when the larynx descends. The hyoid bone, which anchors the tongue muscles, also provides clues. Based on these indicators, scientists believe the larynx began descending sometime in the Homo lineage, perhaps starting with Homo heidelbergensis, around 500,000 years ago. Full descent to the modern position probably occurred later, perhaps with Homo sapiens. Earlier hominins, like Australopithecus or early Homo species, probably had a larynx positioned more like modern apes. This means they could not produce the full range of sounds modern humans can. Their vocalizations would have been more limited, more ape-like. This does not mean they were silent. They could make sounds. But those sounds would have been less varied, less precise, less suitable for conveying complex linguistic information. Their communication was probably more gesture-based and less vocal than ours. Tongue control is also important for speech. The tongue shapes sounds, forming consonants and modulating vowels. The hypoglossal canal, a hole in the skull through which the hypoglossal nerve passes to innervate the tongue, provides a clue about tongue control. Modern humans have a large hypoglossal canal, suggesting fine tongue control. Neanderthals also had large hypoglossal canals, suggesting they too had good tongue control and possibly complex vocalization. Earlier, hominins had smaller canals, suggesting less precise tongue control. Now, let us consider breathing control. Speech requires precise control over exhalation. We modulate airflow to produce different sounds, to vary volume and pitch, to speak in long sentences without pausing to breathe after every word. This requires neural control over the muscles involved in breathing. Evidence suggests this control increased in the Homo lineage. The thoracic vertebrae, the spinal bones in the chest region, have enlarged nerve canals in modern humans compared to apes. This suggests increased neural innervation of breathing muscles, which would be necessary for speech. Brain size is obviously relevant. Brains are expensive to maintain, consuming about 20% of the body's energy. Evolution does not produce large brains without reason. The human brain tripled in size over the past 2 million years. Australopithecus had brains around 400 to 500 cubic centimeters, similar to chimpanzees. Early Homo species had brains around 600 to 800 cubic centimeters. Homo erectus reached 900 to 1,000 cubic centimeters. Homo heidelbergensis reached 1,200 cubic centimeters. Modern humans average about 1,300 to 1,500 cubic centimeters. But size alone does not tell the full story. Brain structure matters. Certain regions of the modern human brain are specialized for language. Broca's area in the frontal lobe is involved in speech production. Wernicke's area in the temporal lobe is involved in language comprehension. These areas do not fossilize directly, but skull shape can reveal brain shape. Endocasts, casts of the interior of skulls, show that brain organization changed during human evolution. Broca's area became more prominent. This suggests increasing specialization for language-related functions. When did this specialization occur? Difficult to say precisely. Homo habilis, around 2 million years ago, shows some asymmetry in brain structure that might indicate the beginnings of lateralization, the specialization of the left hemisphere for language that is characteristic of modern humans. Homo erectus, from about 2 million to 300,000 years ago, had larger brains with more prominent frontal lobes. This suggests increasing cognitive complexity. But whether they had full language is debated. Neanderthals are particularly interesting. They had brains as large as modern humans, sometimes larger. Their skull bases suggest a descended larynx. Their hypoglossal canals were large. Anatomically, they seem capable of speech. Genetic evidence supports this. Neanderthals had a version of the FOXP2 gene, a gene associated with speech and language in modern humans. They may have had language, though we cannot know how sophisticated it was. At minimum, they had complex communication. They coordinated hunts, made sophisticated tools, cared for their sick. This requires communication. But what about earlier species? Homo erectus lived from about 2 million to 300,000 years ago. They had brains about 2/3 the size of modern humans. They used fire, made sophisticated tools, spread across Africa, Asia, and Europe. They must have had some form of complex communication to coordinate these activities. But did they have language? Probably not full language as we know it. Their larynx was probably not fully descended. Their brain structure was less specialized. They likely had a communication system more advanced than apes, but simpler than modern human language, a proto-language perhaps. Even earlier hominins, like Homo habilis or Australopithecus, probably communicated much like modern apes. Vocalizations, gestures, facial expressions, body language, simple, direct, focused on immediate needs and social interactions. Not symbolic, not grammatical, not capable of discussing abstract concepts or events displaced in time and space, but effective enough for their lifestyle, which was probably not vastly different from chimpanzees in terms of social complexity. The anatomical evidence, then, suggests a gradual evolution of communication abilities. Starting from an ape-like baseline, our ancestors slowly evolved the physical equipment necessary for complex vocalization. Brain size increased. Brain structure became more specialized. Vocal anatomy changed. Breathing control improved. Tongue precision increased. This happened over millions of years, and each step probably corresponded to incremental improvements in communication ability. Not a sudden leap from no language to full language, but a gradual transition through intermediate stages. Understanding those intermediate stages is our next challenge. Gesture, the foundation of communication. Many researchers believe that gesture was the foundation of human language, that before we spoke, we gestured, that the first symbolic communication was manual, not vocal. This is called the gestural origin theory of language, and it has substantial support. Let us explore why gesture is such a compelling candidate for the origin of language, and what this tells us about how our ancestors communicated before they could speak. First, consider the evidence from apes we discussed earlier. Apes use gestures flexibly and intentionally. They point, they beckon, they extend hands to request. These gestures are directed at specific individuals. They are modified based on context. They show intentionality in a way that vocalizations do not. An ape scream is an emotional outburst, but a gesture is a deliberate communication act. This suggests that the cognitive capacity for intentional symbolic communication was first expressed through gesture, not vocalization. Second, gestures are inherently iconic. They can resemble what they represent. If I want to communicate bird, I can flap my arms like wings. If I want to communicate drink, I can mime bringing a cup to my lips. Iconic gestures require less arbitrary convention than words. The connection between sign and meaning is transparent. This makes them easier to invent and easier to understand without prior agreement. For a communication system emerging from scratch, iconicity is a huge advantage. Third, gesture is visual, which has advantages for early communication. Vocal signals can be heard only if the listener is within earshot and there is no interfering noise, but gestures can be seen at a distance in clear conditions. They allow silent communication, useful when hunting or hiding from predators. They work when your mouth is full. They complement vocalizations, adding nuance and clarity. Even today, humans gesture constantly when speaking. Try talking with your hands tied behind your back. It is difficult. We are natural gesturers. Fourth, the neural control for manual gesture was probably in place before the control for complex vocalization evolved. Our ancestors were already using their hands for tool making. Homo habilis, over 2 million years ago, made stone tools. This requires fine motor control, planning, mental representation of the desired outcome. The same neural machinery that controls precise hand movements for tool making could be co-opted for gestural communication. The brain regions that control hand movements and those that control language are closely connected even today. In fact, Broca's area, the brain region most associated with speech production, is also active during manual actions and gestures. This is not a coincidence. It suggests these functions are evolutionarily linked. Broca's area may have originally evolved for manual control and only later became specialized for speech. Supporting this, some stroke patients who cannot speak can still gesture to communicate. The manual system remains intact even when the vocal system fails. This suggests gesture is primary, speech secondary. Now, let us imagine how gestural communication might have worked for our ancestors. Start with simple indexical gestures. Pointing. Pointing is arguably the most basic form of symbolic communication. It directs attention to something. A chimpanzee can point, though not as reliably as humans. Human infants begin pointing around 9 to 12 months before they have words. Pointing creates shared attention, the foundation of communication. I point at a tree. You look at the tree. We are now both thinking about the same thing. This is crucial. From pointing, we can move to iconic gestures, miming actions, or objects. A hunter wants to tell the group he saw a deer. He puts his hands to his head to represent antlers, or he mimes the bounding gait of a deer. The group understands. Information is transmitted. No words needed. This kind of gestural pantomime can convey surprisingly complex information. Where the deer was, how large it was, which direction it went, whether it seemed healthy or injured, all through gesture. Over time, these iconic gestures can become conventionalized. The gesture for deer does not have to look exactly like antlers every time. It can be simplified, stylized, become more abstract. This is exactly what happens in sign languages. Modern sign languages, like American Sign Language, started with iconic signs that over time became more abstract and arbitrary. The sign for tree in ASL originally showed the trunk and branches, but evolved into a more stylized movement. This same process probably occurred in proto-human gestural communication. But gesture has limitations. It requires line of sight. You cannot gesture in the dark or when the other person is not looking. You cannot gesture while your hands are occupied carrying something. You cannot gesture at great distances. These limitations may have driven the evolution of vocal language. Vocal signals work in the dark, work when hands are busy, work at greater distances. Once the anatomical capacity for complex vocalization evolved, it made sense to transfer some communication from the manual to the vocal channel. Interestingly, this transition from gesture to speech may have left traces we can still observe. When people speak, they gesture. These co-speech gestures are not random. They are tightly integrated with speech, occurring at specific moments, conveying information that complements or supplements the words. Sometimes gestures convey information not present in the words at all. People describing a spiral staircase will make a spiral motion with their hand, even as they say spiral staircase. The gesture adds spatial information words alone cannot easily convey. This intimate connection between gesture and speech suggests they evolved together, or that speech evolved from gesture, but the two remain linked. Studies show that preventing people from gesturing actually impairs their speech. They pause more, use more vague words, have more difficulty conveying spatial information. Gesture is not just an add-on to speech. It is deeply integrated into how we think and communicate. This makes sense if gesture came first and speech was added later, building on the gestural foundation. Evidence from deaf communities supports the gestural origin theory. When deaf children are not taught a formal sign language, they spontaneously develop home sign systems. These are gestural communication systems that emerge naturally without formal instruction. They have many language-like properties: consistent signs for objects and actions, basic grammar, ability to discuss non-present entities. This shows that the human capacity for creating symbolic gestural communication is innate. Give children the need to communicate and prevent vocal speech, and they will invent gesture-based language. Moreover, when a community of deaf individuals comes together without a shared sign language, they create new sign languages from scratch. This has happened multiple times in history. Nicaraguan Sign Language emerged in the 1980s when deaf students were brought together in schools for the first time. Within a generation, They created a fully complex language with grammar, syntax, the full power of human language, but in the visual gestural modality. This demonstrates that the capacity for gestural language is deeply rooted in human cognition. So, how might this have worked for early humans? Imagine a group of Homo heidelbergensis, 500,000 years ago. They do not have full speech yet. Their larynx is partially descended. They can make some vocalizations, but not the full range of modern speech sounds. But they have large brains, complex social structures, they hunt cooperatively, they make sophisticated tools. They need to communicate. They use a rich system of gestures, pointing, iconic miming, conventionalized signs for common objects and actions. They combine these gestures in sequences to convey complex meanings. They also use vocalizations, but these are more like ape calls. Emotional, innate, not symbolic. Alarm calls for danger, food calls, calls to maintain group cohesion, but the sophisticated symbolic communication happens through gesture. A hunter gestures. I saw 3 deer over the hill. We should go there tomorrow morning. The gesture might be stylized and quick, but the group understands because they share a gestural vocabulary. This is proto-language. Symbolic, combinatorial, but manual rather than vocal. Over time, as vocal anatomy improved, some gestures were replaced by words, but the transition was gradual. For a long time, gesture and vocalization probably coexisted, each used when most appropriate. Eventually, vocal language became dominant, but gesture never disappeared. We still use it today. Every time you point, every time you shrug, every time you wave goodbye, you are using communication forms that probably predate speech by hundreds of thousands of years. Gesture is ancient. Gesture is fundamental. Gesture may have been the key that unlocked human language. Let me give you some concrete examples of how powerful gestural communication can be. Consider modern deaf communities who use sign languages. These are not simplified or limited communication systems. American Sign Language, British Sign Language, and other sign languages are fully expressive languages capable of conveying any concept that spoken languages can convey. They have complex grammar, abstract vocabulary, the ability to discuss philosophy, poetry, humor, anything. This demonstrates that the visual gestural modality is fully capable of supporting complete language. But even more interesting are cases of gestural communication without formal sign language. There are documented cases of deaf individuals who were never taught sign language, but developed their own gestural systems to communicate with their families. These home signs are simpler than full sign languages, but still sophisticated. They have consistent signs for objects and actions, basic word order rules, the ability to reference things not present. They show that humans will spontaneously create gestural communication systems when needed. Another fascinating example comes from studies of gesture in different cultures. Every culture uses gesture, but the specific gestures vary. The thumbs up gesture means okay in many Western cultures, but is offensive in some Middle Eastern cultures. Nodding for yes and shaking head for no is common in most cultures, but reversed in a few. The specific forms are culturally learned, but the tendency to gesture is universal. This suggests gesture is deeply rooted in human nature, predating any particular culture. Children provide another window into gestural communication. Before infants can speak, they gesture. They point to things they want. They reach toward objects. They wave bye-bye. These gestures emerge before words, suggesting they are developmentally primary. Moreover, the age at which infants begin gesturing predicts when they will begin speaking. Early gesturers tend to be early talkers. This supports the idea that gesture and language are linked, that gesture forms a foundation for language development. Vocalization before speech. While gesture may have been primary, vocalization was never absent. Our ancestors made sounds. The question is, what kinds of sounds and what information did they convey? To answer this, we need to think about the continuum between ape-like calls and human speech. What are the intermediate stages? What can we learn from comparing different communication systems, from apes to humans to modern human infants? Let us explore the evolution of vocalization and what our ancestors might have sounded like. Start with the basics. All primates vocalize. Even the simplest primates, like lemurs, have alarm calls. Vervet monkeys famously have different alarm calls for different predators. One for eagles, one for leopards, one for snakes. Each call triggers a different escape response. Look up for eagles, run into trees for leopards, look down for snakes. This shows that even relatively simple primate vocalizations can carry specific information. They are not just noise. They are signals with meaning. But these calls are innate. A baby vervet monkey does not need to learn the alarm calls. It is born with the capacity to produce them and to understand them. Over time, with experience, the monkey gets better at using them appropriately. Young monkeys sometimes give the eagle alarm for falling leaves, but they learn discrimination. But the calls themselves are not learned. They are genetic. This is fundamentally different from human words, which are entirely learned and arbitrary. Our ancestors probably started with similar innate vocalizations. Australopithecus, the early hominins who lived from about 4 to 2 million years ago, probably had calls much like modern apes. Alarm calls for predators, food calls when finding a good food source, contact calls to maintain group cohesion, screams when attacked or in pain. These calls conveyed emotional states and basic information about the environment. But they were not words. They were not symbolic. They were hardwired emotional expressions. Now, an interesting question. When did vocalizations start to become learned rather than innate? When did the transition from calls to words begin? This is difficult to determine from fossils, but we can make inferences from brain structure and vocal anatomy. The descended larynx, which allows a wider range of sounds, is necessary but not sufficient for speech. You also need the neural control to learn to produce those sounds voluntarily. Apes cannot do this. Humans can. When did this ability evolve? Comparative neuroscience provides clues. In humans, speech production is controlled by the motor cortex and several other brain regions, including Broca's area. These regions send signals directly to the muscles of the larynx, tongue, and lips, allowing fine voluntary control. In monkeys and apes, vocalization is controlled more by older brain regions associated with emotion. The limbic system, the periaqueductal gray. This means their calls are emotional expressions, not voluntary acts. You cannot easily teach an ape to say a new sound on command. But humans, even human infants, can learn new sounds. Babies babble, producing a wide variety of sounds, then narrow down to the specific sounds of their native language. This vocal learning ability is rare among mammals. Besides humans, it is found in some whales and dolphins, in bats, in elephants, and in some birds like parrots and songbirds. In most of these species, vocal learning evolved for social communication and bonding. The same is probably true for humans. We needed to learn vocalizations to create flexible, symbolic communication. When did humans gain this ability? Genetic evidence provides one clue. The FOXP2 gene is associated with speech and language. Mutations in this gene cause severe speech and language disorders in humans. Interestingly, the human version of FOXP2 differs from the chimpanzee version by just 2 amino acid changes. These changes occurred sometime in the last 600,000 years, possibly as recently as 200,000 years ago. Neanderthals had the human version of FOXP2, suggesting they also had the neural basis for complex vocalization. But FOXP2 is not a language gene in the simplistic sense. It is involved in many aspects of motor control, not just speech. It affects the ability to learn sequences of fine motor movements, which includes both speech and manual actions like toolmaking. This supports the idea that language evolved from a foundation of motor control, whether manual or vocal. The ability to learn and execute complex motor sequences may have been the crucial innovation that allowed both advanced toolmaking and language to evolve. So, imagine the intermediate stages. Early hominins like Australopithecus or early Homo had mostly innate vocalizations, calls like apes. But as brain size increased, as the motor cortex expanded, as connections developed between motor control regions and the vocal apparatus, some voluntary control over vocalizations began to emerge. Perhaps they could modulate the pitch or duration of a call. Perhaps they could suppress a call when it was inappropriate to vocalize. Small steps toward voluntary vocal control. By the time of Homo erectus, 1 million or more years ago, voluntary vocal control may have been more developed. Maybe they could learn a few simple vocalizations, modifying innate calls into something more flexible. Maybe different groups had slightly different vocal traditions, the beginnings of vocal culture. Maybe mothers and infants used vocalizations to bond, and those vocalizations were learned rather than innate. This would be proto-speech, still largely non-symbolic, still emotionally driven, but starting to show flexibility and learning. An interesting model for this stage might be gelada monkeys. Geladas are African monkeys that live in large social groups and have a rich vocal repertoire. Uniquely among primates, geladas engage in vocal turn-taking. One individual vocalizes, another responds, back and forth, like a conversation. They also have contact calls that show individual variation, suggesting some degree of vocal learning. While still mostly innate, gelada vocalizations show hints of the flexibility that would be necessary for language. Our ancestors may have gone through a similar stage. Another model is the vocal communication of human infants before they acquire language. Babies cry, and different cries signal different needs: hunger, pain, discomfort, sleepiness. Parents learn to distinguish these cries. Babies also coo, babble, make various sounds. Some of these sounds seem to be for practice, for exploring what the vocal apparatus can do. Some are social, designed to engage caregivers. This pre-linguistic vocal behavior in infants may recapitulate, in compressed form, stages our species went through evolutionarily. Prosody, the melody and rhythm of speech, is also interesting. Even when we cannot understand the words someone is speaking, we can often understand the emotional tone from prosody. A question sounds different from a statement. Anger sounds different from happiness. Sarcasm conveys meaning through tone that may contradict the literal words. Prosody is ancient. It probably predates words. Our ancestors could convey emotional information through tone of voice long before they could form words. Prosody may be a relic of pre-linguistic vocalization. Singing is another clue. Music and language are closely related neurologically. Some researchers propose that singing, or something like it, may have preceded speech. A musical proto-language, communicating emotion and social bonding through melody and rhythm. Modern humans universally engage in music. Every culture has songs. Mothers sing to infants in every society. This suggests music is deeply rooted in human nature. Maybe our ancestors sang before they spoke. Maybe melody carried meaning before words did. This is speculative, but there are intriguing hints. The descended larynx that allows speech also allows singing. The breath control needed for speech also allows sustained singing. The brain regions involved in music overlap substantially with those involved in language. Children learn songs easily, often before they master complex grammar. Music and language may have co-evolved, or one may have preceded the other. Either way, vocalization before full speech probably had musical qualities: rhythm, pitch variation, emotional expressiveness. Putting this together, we can imagine early human vocalization as a blend. Innate emotional calls inherited from ape ancestors, overlaid with increasing voluntary control, modulated by prosody and rhythm, used to convey emotional states and maintain social bonds. Not yet symbolic, not yet grammatical, but richer and more flexible than ape calls. Gradually, over hundreds of thousands of years, these vocalizations would become more complex, more learned, more symbolic. Eventually, they would become words. But that transition took time, and during that time, vocalization coexisted with gesture, each supplementing the other. The role of symbols and culture. Now we come to perhaps the most important question. When and how did symbolic thought emerge? Because language is fundamentally symbolic. Words are symbols, arbitrary sounds or signs that stand for things. The word tree is not a tree. It is a symbol that represents the concept of a tree. This symbolic capacity is what distinguishes human language from animal communication. Ape calls are not symbolic. They are direct expressions of internal states. But human words are symbols, and using symbols requires a different kind of cognition. When did symbolic thought evolve? We can look for evidence in the archaeological record. Symbols leave traces. Art, ornaments, ritual objects. The earliest undisputed symbolic objects are shell beads from Africa, dated to around 75,000 years ago. These are shells with holes drilled through them, clearly intended to be strung as ornaments. Ornaments are symbolic. They convey status, group membership, individual identity. They have meaning beyond their physical form. This shows symbolic thinking. Cave paintings provide dramatic evidence of symbolic thought. The oldest known cave paintings, from Indonesia and Spain, date to around 40,000 years ago. These paintings depict animals, human hands, abstract symbols. They were created in deep, dark caves, requiring lamps and planning. They clearly had symbolic or ritual significance. People invested substantial effort to create them. They meant something. This is unambiguous evidence of symbolic culture. And if they had symbolic art, they almost certainly had symbolic language. But symbolic thought may be older than the oldest surviving art. Art requires specific conditions to preserve. It needs to be in a protected location, like a cave. It needs to be made with durable materials. Most symbolic behavior probably does not preserve archaeologically. Body painting, temporary decorations, symbolic gestures, stories told around fires. None of these leave fossils, so the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Symbolic thought could be older than 75,000 years. How much older is unknown. Some researchers argue that sophisticated toolmaking implies symbolic thought. Making a complex stone tool, like a hand axe, requires a mental template, a concept of what the finished product should look like. You are shaping stone to match an idea in your mind. This is arguably symbolic. The mental image represents the physical object you are creating. Hand axes appear around 1.7 million years ago with Homo erectus. Does this mean Homo erectus had symbolic thought? Maybe. Or maybe this kind of procedural knowledge is different from linguistic symbolism. There is a difference between practical knowledge and abstract symbolism. You can know how to make a hand axe without being able to discuss the concept of hand axe in the abstract. Animals can have complex behaviors without symbolic thought. Birds build intricate nests, bees do waggle dances to communicate, but these are not symbolic in the linguistic sense. So, toolmaking alone may not prove symbolic thought, but it does show increasing cognitive sophistication, which probably laid the groundwork for symbols to emerge later. Culture is closely related to symbolic thought. Culture is socially transmitted information. Knowledge, skills, traditions passed from one generation to the next through learning rather than genetics. All great apes have culture. Different chimpanzee groups have different tool use traditions, different grooming styles, different hunting techniques. This shows that culture does not require language, but human culture is vastly more complex and cumulative than ape culture. We build on previous generations, ratcheting up complexity over time. Language makes this possible. Without language, cultural transmission is limited. You can learn by watching, by trial and error, by direct demonstration. But you cannot be told how to do something. You cannot receive verbal instruction. You cannot be warned about dangers you have not personally witnessed. You cannot learn from mistakes made by people who lived before you. Language allows us to share knowledge across time and space. It allows cumulative culture. This is why human culture is so rich, and ape culture, though present, is so limited. So when did cumulative culture begin? Archaeological evidence suggests a major acceleration around 50 to 70,000 years ago. Tool technologies become more diverse. Art appears. Evidence of long-distance trade networks. Shells from the coast found hundreds of kilometers inland. Stone from specific quarries found far from their source. Symbolic ornaments. Carefully constructed shelters. All of this suggests more complex social organization, more sophisticated knowledge transmission. This is sometimes called the Great Leap Forward, or the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. But was this a sudden revolution, or a gradual development? The evidence is debated. Some regions show these changes earlier, some later. Africa shows evidence of symbolic behavior earlier than Europe. This may reflect migrations, with modern humans carrying these behaviors out of Africa. Or it may reflect preservation bias. Older sites are less likely to preserve evidence. But there does seem to be a qualitative shift sometime in the last 100,000 years. Something changed. Many researchers believe that something was the emergence of full language. Here's a key insight. Language and symbolic culture reinforce each other. Symbols require language to fully express their meaning, and language requires symbols to function. You cannot have complex language without the cognitive capacity for symbolic thought. And symbolic thought is vastly more powerful when you can communicate those symbols linguistically. So language and symbolic culture probably co-evolved, each driving the evolution of the other. This created a positive feedback loop. Better communication allowed more complex culture, which created pressure for even better communication. Before this feedback loop fully engaged, what was communication like? Probably a mix. Some symbolic gestures and vocalizations, but many non-symbolic signals. A gesture meaning danger might be partly iconic, partly conventional, but not fully arbitrary. A vocalization meaning food might be an elaborated version of an innate call. The system would be intermediate, more symbolic than ape communication, less symbolic than full human language. Enough to support some cultural transmission, but not the cumulative culture we see in modern humans. Imagine a group of early Homo sapiens, 150,000 years ago, before full language. They have fire, they make tools, they hunt cooperatively. They must coordinate. How? Partly through gesture, pointing, miming, conventionalized signs for common objects. Partly through vocalizations, some learned words, but limited vocabulary. Partly through demonstration, I show you how to make this tool. You watch and imitate. Partly through innate calls, alarm calls, food calls. It is a multimodal communication system, utilizing every channel available. They can communicate about the here and now pretty well. I see a herd of antelope over that hill. Let us go hunt them. But discussing the abstract, the distant in time or space, is harder. They might struggle to discuss what happened last year, or what they should do next month. They might have difficulty with counterfactuals, with hypothetical situations. Their culture accumulates slowly because knowledge transfer is inefficient. Each generation must relearn much of what the previous generation knew. Progress is slow. Then, gradually, language becomes more complex. Vocabulary expands. Grammar emerges. Rules for combining words to create new meanings. Suddenly, you can say things like, if we go to the river tomorrow, we might find fish, or the hunters who went north yesterday saw lions. You can discuss the past and future. You can make plans. You can teach through verbal instruction, not just demonstration. Knowledge accumulates. Culture becomes cumulative. Innovation accelerates. This is the great leap forward. And it was driven by language. But even after full language emerged, non-linguistic communication remained important. We still gesture. We still read facial expressions. We still respond to tone of voice. These ancient communication channels were not replaced by language. They were supplemented by it. Language added a powerful new dimension to communication, but the old dimensions remained. This is why human communication is so rich and multimodal. We use every channel available: words, tone, gesture, facial expression, body language, touch. We are communicating on multiple levels simultaneously. And here is something interesting. Even today, in cultures with full language, nonverbal communication carries crucial information. Studies show that when verbal and nonverbal messages conflict, people tend to believe the nonverbal. If I say I am not angry, but my face is red and my fists are clenched, you will not believe my words. The ancient signals, the facial expressions and body language, are trusted more than words, because they are harder to fake, because they are more deeply rooted in our biology, because they predate language and tap into more primitive, more reliable communication channels. This tells us something profound. Language did not replace earlier communication systems. It built on them. It added to them. The result is the incredibly rich, multimodal, complex communication system modern humans use. We can say I love you in words, but we also convey it through touch, through facial expression, through tone of voice, through gesture. All of these channels together create the full message, and all of these channels have deep evolutionary roots, extending back before language, before symbols, back to our pre-human ancestors. The emergence of full language. So when and how did full language emerge? This is the million-dollar question in the study of language evolution. And the honest answer is, we do not know for certain. We have theories, we have evidence, but no definitive proof. Let us examine the leading theories and what they tell us about the transition from proto-language to full language. This transition is arguably the most important event in human cognitive evolution. It made us who we are. First, we need to define what we mean by full language. Language has several key properties that distinguish it from simpler communication systems. Productivity, the ability to create an infinite number of messages from a finite set of elements. Displacement, the ability to talk about things not present in space or time. Arbitrariness, the symbols are arbitrary, not iconic. Structure dependence, grammar rules apply to categories and structures, not just linear order. Recursion, the ability to embed clauses within clauses, creating sentences of unlimited complexity. All human languages have these properties. No animal communication system has all of them. Proto-languages, the intermediate stages between ape communication and full human language, probably had some but not all of these properties. Understanding which properties emerged when is key to understanding language evolution. So let us go through them one by one and consider when they might have evolved and what cognitive changes were necessary. Productivity, the ability to combine elements in new ways, probably emerged relatively early. Even with a small vocabulary of gestures or vocalizations, you can combine them. Hand sign for you, hand sign for go, hand sign for water. Combined sequentially means you go water, a novel message created from existing elements. This requires memory and sequencing ability, but not necessarily grammar. Apes can learn to combine a few signs, so productivity in a basic form may have existed in proto-language. Displacement, talking about things not present, is trickier. It requires mental representation, the ability to think about things not currently perceived. To discuss yesterday's hunt, you must remember it and represent it mentally. To plan tomorrow's hunt, you must imagine it. These cognitive abilities probably evolved gradually. Theory of mind, the ability to understand that others have minds with beliefs and desires different from your own, is related. It requires representing mental states. Humans have sophisticated theory of mind. Apes have rudimentary theory of mind. This probably evolved in stages. Arbitrariness, the use of symbols that do not resemble what they represent, is crucial for language, but may have emerged gradually. Early gestures were probably iconic, but as we discussed, iconic gestures can become conventionalized and arbitrary over time. Modern sign languages demonstrate this process. Words in spoken languages are almost entirely arbitrary. The sound dog has no resemblance to an actual dog. This arbitrariness allows vocabulary to expand infinitely, unconstrained by the need for iconic resemblance, but it requires shared convention and learning. Structure dependence and grammar are perhaps the most distinctive features of human language. Grammar allows us to specify relationships. Who did what? To whom? When? Why? It allows us to form questions, negations, conditionals. It provides the structure that turns a list of words into a coherent sentence with precise meaning. Where did grammar come from? This is one of the deepest mysteries. Some linguists, like Noam Chomsky, argue that grammar is innate, a biological endowment, a language instinct. Others argue it emerged from usage patterns and was culturally transmitted. The debate between nativist and usage-based theories of grammar is complex and ongoing. The nativist view is that humans have a genetically specified universal grammar, a set of principles and parameters that all languages follow. This would have evolved as a biological adaptation, probably through natural selection, because it provided such enormous advantages. The usage-based view is that grammar emerges from general cognitive abilities and social learning shaped by the pressures of communication over many generations. Evidence exists for both views. All human languages do share deep structural similarities, suggesting some innate constraints. But languages also vary enormously in their specific grammars, suggesting cultural evolution plays a large role. Probably the truth is somewhere in between. Some innate biases and capacities, shaped and refined by cultural evolution. In any case, grammar did not appear overnight. It must have evolved gradually, with increasingly complex structures emerging over time. Recursion, the ability to embed clauses within clauses, is sometimes argued to be the defining feature of human language. The sentence, "The man who saw the woman who bought the car that was parked on the street went home," embeds multiple clauses. This allows infinite complexity from finite means. Some argue recursion was the final piece, the crucial innovation that made full language possible. Others argue recursion is not as central as sometimes claimed, pointing out that some languages use recursion sparingly. So when did all of this come together? When did proto-language become full language? The archaeological evidence of symbolic culture suggests it was within the last 100,000 years, possibly as recently as 50,000 years ago. But language may not leave clear archaeological traces. You can have complex language without art or ornaments, so language could be older. Genetic evidence from FOXP2 and other genes suggests key mutations within the last few 100,000 years. Anatomical evidence suggests the necessary vocal apparatus was in place by 300,000 years ago. A reasonable guess, synthesizing all the evidence, is that proto-language existed from perhaps 500,000 to 100,000 years ago. Full language emerged sometime in the last 100,000 years, possibly in Africa before modern humans spread to the rest of the world. This timeline fits the anatomical, genetic, and archaeological evidence, but it is still a hypothesis, subject to revision as new evidence emerges. The important point is that language evolution was a gradual process, not a sudden event. And here is a crucial insight. Once full language emerged, it transformed everything. It allowed cumulative culture to accelerate. It allowed humans to cooperate in larger groups. It allowed planning and coordination at unprecedented scales. It allowed the transmission of abstract knowledge. It created a new dimension of human existence, the symbolic, the conceptual, the world of ideas. Language did not just change how we communicate, it changed how we think. It changed what it means to be human. Before language, human life was probably similar to that of other great apes. Small social groups, limited cultural transmission, focus on immediate survival. After language, humans could form tribes, nations, civilizations. We could create science, philosophy, literature, law. We could build on the knowledge of previous generations, creating an ever-expanding body of collective knowledge. We could imagine futures and work toward them. We could reflect on our own existence and ask, why are we here? Language made all of this possible. It is the foundation of everything we recognize as human culture. Conclusion. Let us recap this remarkable journey. We started with a question. How did humans communicate before language? We have explored multiple answers, each revealing part of the story. Our ancestors started with communication systems, similar to those of modern apes. Innate vocalizations, facial expressions, body language, simple gestures. These were effective for basic social coordination and expressing emotional states. But they were limited. They could not convey complex, abstract, displaced information. They could not support cumulative culture. Over millions of years, these systems became more sophisticated. Gestures became more intentional, more flexible, possibly more symbolic. Vocalizations came under increasing voluntary control. Brain size increased. Brain structure became more specialized. Vocal anatomy changed, allowing a wider range of sounds. The cognitive capacity for symbolic thought emerged. Cultural transmission became possible, then increasingly complex. Proto-language developed. Communication that was symbolic and combinatorial, but lacked the full complexity of modern language. Finally, within the last 100,000 years, possibly much more recently, full language emerged. Grammar developed, allowing complex meanings to be expressed through structured combinations of symbols. Recursion allowed infinite productivity from finite means. Displacement allowed discussion of the absent and abstract. Arbitrariness freed symbols from iconic constraints. And human communication became what it is today, the most sophisticated communication system known in the natural world. A system that allows us to share knowledge across generations, to cooperate in groups of millions, to build civilizations. But the ancient forms of communication never disappeared. We still gesture when we speak. We still read facial expressions intuitively. We still respond to tone of voice. We still use touch to comfort and bond. These pre-linguistic communication channels remain active, remain important. They complement language, adding emotional nuance and social information that words alone cannot convey. Human communication is multimodal because it built on, rather than replaced, earlier systems. We use every channel evolution gave us. Understanding this evolutionary history gives us perspective on language and communication today. Language feels natural and effortless because we evolved to use it. Babies learn language without formal instruction, simply through exposure. This is because language is a biological adaptation, something our brains are wired for. But that wiring took millions of years to evolve. It built on earlier communication systems. It required changes in anatomy, in brain structure, in genes. It was not magic. It was evolution. It also helps us appreciate the diversity of communication. Not all communication is linguistic. Not all meaning is conveyed through words. A smile, a gesture, a tone of voice. These communicate powerfully. In fact, studies show that when verbal and nonverbal messages conflict, we trust the nonverbal. The ancient signals, rooted deep in our evolutionary history, are often more reliable than words. Understanding this can make us better communicators. Pay attention not just to what people say, but how they say it, what their bodies are doing, what their faces express. Moreover, understanding pre-linguistic communication helps us understand human diversity. Different cultures use gesture differently. Some cultures gesture more, some less. Some have different norms for eye contact, for personal space, for touch. These are cultural variations on ancient biological themes. Recognizing that communication is multimodal and culturally variable can help us navigate a diverse world. It reminds us that there are many ways to communicate effectively, many ways to be human. And finally, thinking about how humans communicated before language reminds us of what language is for. It is not just for conveying information, it is for building relationships, for sharing experiences, for coordinating action, for transmitting culture, for expressing who we are. These functions were served by pre-linguistic communication, and language enhanced them but did not replace them. Communication is fundamentally social. It connects us to others. It makes us human. Imagine meeting one of our ancestors, a human from 200,000 years ago, before full language. You could not speak to them. They would not understand your words, and you would not understand theirs, if they had any. But you could communicate. You could smile, and they would smile back. You could point, and they would look. You could gesture your intentions, and they might understand. You could share food, and they would know it as a gesture of friendship. The ancient channels would still work, because they are older than words. They are deeper than language. They are the foundation on which language was built. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of pre-linguistic communication. It is a topic that takes us deep into human evolution, into the nature of mind and language, into what makes us who we are. The journey from ape-like calls and gestures to full human language was long, gradual, and transformative. It changed our species in fundamental ways, but it did not erase the past. The ancient forms of communication persist, woven into the fabric of how we interact. We are speaking apes, but we are still apes. And understanding that duality helps us understand ourselves. As we close, let me leave you with some practical implications of understanding pre-linguistic communication. First, it reminds us to pay attention to nonverbal signals. In our word-focused world, we sometimes forget that communication is multimodal. We focus on what people say and ignore how they say it, what their bodies are doing, what their faces express. But those nonverbal signals carry crucial information. They are often more honest than words because they are harder to control consciously. Learning to read them makes us better communicators and better at understanding others. Second, it gives us perspective on children and language development. When a toddler is struggling to express something and gets frustrated, remember, they are recapitulating millions of years of evolution. The difficulty of moving from pre-linguistic to linguistic communication is immense. Be patient. Encourage their gestures. Respond to their nonverbal signals. Language will come, but the pre-linguistic communication they are using now is sophisticated and meaningful. They are communicating, just not with words yet. Third, understanding pre-linguistic communication can help us appreciate people with communication disabilities. Individuals who cannot speak, whether due to autism, stroke, or other conditions, are not without communication. They may use gesture, facial expression, electronic devices, sign language, or other methods. These are legitimate, sophisticated communication systems. They connect to the same ancient roots as spoken language. Respecting and facilitating these alternative communication methods is not just practical, but acknowledges the deep history of human communication. Fourth, it reminds us that communication is about connection, not just information transfer. Yes, language allows us to convey complex information efficiently, but much of communication is social, building relationships, expressing emotions, establishing status, showing care. The pre-linguistic forms of communication excel at these functions. A hug conveys care better than the words "I care about you." A smile builds rapport more effectively than a verbal statement of friendliness. Words are powerful, but they are not everything. Finally, thinking about how our ancestors communicated before language gives us humility. We modern humans, with our vast vocabularies and complex grammars, sometimes forget that language is a recent innovation. Our ancestors survived for hundreds of thousands of years without it. They were intelligent, creative, socially sophisticated people. They formed bonds, raised children, created culture, all without words. Language enhanced human capabilities enormously, but humans were remarkable even before language. We should remember that. The story of pre-linguistic communication is ultimately a story about what makes us human. It is about the deep roots of our social nature, our need to connect with others, our drive to share what is in our minds. These drives existed before language and shaped its evolution. Language did not create our social nature. Our social nature created language. We needed to communicate because we are fundamentally social creatures. And that need, that drive to connect, is older than words, older than grammar, older than our species. It connects us to our ape cousins, to our hominin ancestors, to the deep past of our lineage.